it's another one of these remarkable moments of exchange that we don't think about as often as we should. We think about Cook, we think about um, the sort of the bravery and adventure of Europeans sailing across vast oceans, but we don't think about the sort of information they gain from guides and interpreters and indigenous peoples that allows them to see the world in new ways.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Matthew Lockwood, Professor of History at the University of Alabama. His new book, Explorers, takes a look at the topic we know well from the fourth and fifth grade: who discovered the Pacific Ocean? What about Columbus? And turns it around so that we see exploring on the point of view of where you come from, not who you are. Maybe you come from China, or you come from Europe, or you come from Africa. We begin, however, with the classics world because it tells a story that it was never believed or only believed in pieces, legends. However, Matthew, congratulations. A very good evening to you. You begin with two men, Hanno and Hamilco, who are associated with venturing outside of the Mediterranean. This is 5th century BCE, I believe. And another Greek who ventured as well into the Atlantic or south, turning south from the gates of Gibraltar. These men were not believed all the way up to Marco Polo. What do you learn from looking at explorers who were believed and not believed? What were they looking for? What were their motives to take the risks they did? Good evening to you, Matthew.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I think this is a wonderful place to start because I think it's such a part of the human condition, this desire to seek out the unknown. Our ancestors, all of our ancestors, were migrants out of East Africa and across the world, seeking out something new and different. And I think that's one of the remarkable things about human beings is that we have populated the globe in a way that no other species does. And it is that drive to discover, the curiosity that I think is one of the things that unites everyone. And we see this in these classical accounts. And these accounts are difficult because they often come to us in fragments and pieces, repeated by later sources, and so the details are often sparse, and so we wonder what drove these Carthaginians to sail out from the gates of Gibraltar, and what did they hope to find? And I think from the Carthaginian perspective, this was a seafaring people, a trading people who had already linked the Mediterranean Sea. And so I think it was natural to sail beyond to see what they could find. And I think their stories are fascinating for a number of reasons. And I think one of those is that question of believability. What does it take for these stories to be considered true and fact? And I think there are some remarkable things about these accounts. Some of the things they describe, the Sargasso Sea, the Mid-Atlantic gyre, the currents, are true. They are true, but when they were the only ones to have reported these things, they seem fantastical. And so, for generations, for centuries, these things passed into to myth and legend rather than treated as fact. And it's only much later when some of the things they saw and described were confirmed that we begin to believe. And so, yeah, I think it's a wonderfully fascinating thing that stories are so central to our imagination of the world, and so many of the stories of human civilization are stories of exploration, from the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Odyssey, to so many of the foundation myths of civilizations around the world are about sort of expeditions into the unknown, travels to unknown lands. And so I think from the beginnings, the way we think about ourselves as a people it's through stories of travel and exploration and imaginations of the unknown.
What I discover from your book is that the Chinese civilization warring that it was also discovering Asia and India and Europe. And were they believed? Was Xuan Zhang's account believed, or was it treated as legendary?
So these were very much believed. So these expeditions, the great treasure fleets of the Ming Empire, were enormous expeditions, the largest ships anyone had ever seen at the time, some of the largest sailing ships ever created. And these were expeditions that were outfitted with hundreds and thousands of people, including interpreters, people who spoke the languages they might come across in India and Arabia. So people who spoke Arabic, for instance. And so these were expeditions full of experts. And so when they returned, they were very much believed. It helped that they brought back with them some examples of the things they described that might not have been believed otherwise. So one of the things that makes a big splash in the court in China when they return is a giraffe, which is, of course, a creature that has to be seen to be believed. It is so outlandish that if it had been described, it would have been doubted, but they brought one back. And so these expeditions were very much considered fact, and that was part of the goal. The goal was to learn more about the world beyond China, but also to connect that world back with China. So these were diplomatic missions as well as expeditions of discovery. Yes.
Surprisingly, Greenland's in the news, so let's look at Greenland. Eric the Red and his descendants traveled to Greenland and named a place called Vinland, and the settlement did not last because of climate change. Were they believed?
So often not. So these stories were written down, these accounts of travel to Greenland, which was believed. The Greenland settlement survived into the 15th century, so it lasted quite a long while. But the expeditions to what is now North America and the settlements, the short-term settlements in what is now Canada, those were doubted from the beginning. They were generally not believed, um, and only much later were when archaeological evidence was found was were these stories confirmed. So it took almost 1,000 years before these stories were finally believed. And I think part of the reason for that is some of the things described seem again fantastical, but some of the people involved um, were were not believed because of the roles they played. So Gudrid Far Traveler is one of the most fascinating figures in this, and she is one of the driving forces behind the exploration and at least temporary settlement of Scandinavians in the Americas. She's the one who is driving her husband, who's a merchant, to keep going further from Iceland to Greenland, from Greenland even further west to find the lands that had been sighted previously. And she, I think, in part because of her role in this settlement, is not believed. And so when these accounts are written down, and they're written down sometimes centuries later, they're treated as legends, as stories, as early accounts of exploration often are. They're often treated as entertainment, a good story, kind of science fiction for the medieval world, instead of as strictly factual. And so people sort of come to expect that these accounts are full of exaggeration and invention. And there are many accounts that do that from the age, but the accounts of the Scandinavians who settled in the Americas are true.
Let's talk of the biggest whopper of them all, Marco Polo. Nobody believed him. They still don't, Matthew. We know this.
Yes, yes. Again, another person who's writing, who's living and telling his story. He dictates his story while he's in prison, actually, to a writer. But the writer he dictates the story to is a writer of romances. He's a writer of adventure stories, and that plays a role in the fact that Marco Polo is not believed. But this is an era when travel stories are becoming more and more popular, but popular as entertainment, not necessarily as accurate information about the world. And so what they readers expect is stories of monsters, of strange peoples with the heads of dogs, and things like that. And so some of the things that Polo describes, um, which are true and factual, seem so incredible that people just assume that this is another one of those romantic tales of foreign lands that is invented for the entertainment of the reader. Um, and um, and this carries on after his return for generations. And as you say, there are still those who doubt how far he went and the things he saw. So one of the classic examples is that he doesn't really mention the Great Wall of China. And people from a modern perspective assume if he had actually been to China, he would of course mention it. But from any point on the wall isn't, it's a wall. It doesn't, it's only uh, noteworthy in its extent. And so it's not surprising, perhaps, that he didn't comment on the Great Wall. But I think one of the really fascinating things is that although many in the years after Polo returned from the court of China, uh, many didn't believe him. One of the people who did was Christopher Columbus.
Yes.
Columbus very much believed that Marco Polo had traveled to China, and based some of his calculations about the circumference of the globe, how far a trip west across the Atlantic to Asia would be, how long it would take. He makes notations in his copy of Marco Polo's travels. He treats it as fact, and it's a remarkable sort of coincidence.
Professor Matthew Lockwood, his new book is Explorers, A New History. We've dealt with the classic period, doubt, 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 fragments, archaeology, and here we are, still looking for some of the details in Marco Polo's adventures. Columbus, however, discovers America. However, we're taught that. There's a lot to say about Columbus's brutality and greed. However, what I find in Matthew's book is a new point of view. Matthew, who are the Taino ambassadors and why do they want to go to Europe?
I mean, I think they are the Taino are indigenous peoples from the Caribbean. They are the people who greet Columbus when he arrives. And I think one of the really interesting things about the idea of discovery is that it's very much in the eye of the beholder. It's all about perspective. So Columbus is thought of discovering the America in 1492 when he arrives in the Bahamas. But for the Taino, this is a discovery of something new as well. This moment is a moment of discovery from their perspective too. They are discovering new worlds and new peoples as well. And so I wanted to write this familiar story from their perspective, as much as is possible to recover that perspective. And they are some of the first to not only to meet and greet a person from Eurasia, but to travel to Europe as well. And so just as Columbus discovers the Americas in 1492, these Taino ambassadors also discover Europe for their own people. And they go for a number of reasons. There are some who go as slaves. There are some who Columbus enslaves and takes back to Europe. But there are also some who go as ambassadors. They themselves realize the importance of this moment too. The 1492 is not just a moment that has enormous consequences and ripple effects through Eurasia, but the Americas as well. And they recognize this from the beginning, that this is a new era too. So they're traveling to Spain for similar reasons as Columbus. They're traveling because this is something new and unknown. These are new worlds to them as well. They are curious too. And they see, at least at this moment, the potential for a fruitful connection between these new people who have arrived on their shores from across the sea, and their own world. I think it's really important to take these important moments from multiple perspectives.
Captain Cook sails the Pacific in three famous voyages. I need to mention that those voyages revealed to the people who lived in the Pacific that there was this other world on the other side of the planet. And Matthew takes us to one of them whose name is very difficult to say. He's a native of New South Wales, an indigenous person, Yemmerrawanne, who dies in 1794, but he's buried in England. He's buried in Gravesend near Woolwich. Why did he travel to Europe, and did he leave a record of what he made of England when he got there, Matthew?
Yeah, so he traveled to Europe along with another Eora man named Bennelong, and they traveled to Europe. They volunteered to go. They also were curious about this new world they had learned about after Captain Cook's arrival in what is now Australia, and wanted to see for themselves what this world contained. And Bennelong, in particular, had been since the early days of European colonization in Australia an important go-between between the British and his Eora people. He became a man between worlds, in some ways caught between two worlds. He used his knowledge of the British to increase his stature among his own people, and he used his knowledge of the indigenous peoples of Australia to increase his status among the British. And so when the first British governor of New South Wales returns to England after his tenure is up, Bennelong and his companion agree to go with him. They want to see that world for themselves. They've learned about it through their interactions with the British, and they've learned about Europe, and they want to see it for themselves. And when they're there, they take advantage of that. They attend plays. They go to a famous criminal trial of a British governor of the East India Company. They meet the king. They travel about, they do all the things explorers and travelers do. Unfortunately, only Bennelong returns. Um, and these sorts of accounts are often difficult to get at because they often require us to read against the grain of European accounts because neither Bennelong or his companion left their own records. So we have to find tease out their stories from the records of Europeans or Western travelers.
Matthew Lockwood, his new book, Explorers, A New History, looks at our planet from the point of view of people who were there but don't get written up as famous explorers. They did explore. They explored Europe, some instances. They explored medical science. We turn to a story I had never heard before, and it connects to the people of the United States. There was a smallpox pandemic that stretched across the Atlantic the end of the 18th century. 1772, 74, you've read about how the Adams family risked inoculation of the children and the ordeal because you get sick right away and then come back. Smallpox vaccination. Where did that come from? Who was Mary Wortley Montagu and what did she discover, Matthew?
Yeah, so Mary Wortley Montagu is a fascinating figure. She's the wife of a British ambassador to Constantinople, the Ottoman court. And she insists on traveling with him there and traveling in part overland because she was curious about the worlds she was encountering for the first time. Um, and I think her story is a really important one when we think about the history of exploration, because exploration is also always about exchange. It's about exchange of ideas and information. And her story is the story of a particular exchange that had really important consequences for the world. So she arrives in Constantinople, the wife of an ambassador, and is someone who's curious about um, breaking down the walls that exist between Europeans and Constantinople and the people. And one of the things she encounters in attempting to get to know Ottoman women in particular is this practice of variolation. So variolation, as far as we can tell, begins in China in the 16th century. At least it's the first written evidence we have of it. And this is a practice of using a a minor strain of smallpox to impart immunity. So you intentionally infect someone with a minor strain of smallpox to impart immunity in the future. And it has passed from China through the Middle East. It's known in Islamic Africa, but it is unknown in Europe until Mary Wortley Montagu sees Ottoman women performing this procedure. She's brave enough to have her young son variolated for smallpox, and I think this is smallpox was the great dread disease of the age, and so she's willing to watch this procedure, then to have it done on her son, and not only that, but to bring it back to England as a practice that should be adopted to advocate for it for this process of variolation. And from there are experiments in England. Eventually, the son of the king is variolated, and we get this knowledge of this life-saving procedure spreading from China to the Middle East, all the way to Europe.
A human astronomer. His name is Tupaia. And Matthew introduces him as the secret to Captain Cook's second voyage, maybe the secret to the Pacific for the British Empire. Who was Tupaia, born in 1725? What is that magic he has, Matthew?
Yeah, so he's a Polynesian star navigator. So he's someone who can read the stars and the currents and the winds and navigate across vast distances. And this is one of the fascinating things about human beings in general, but the Polynesians are a wonderful example that they set out across great distances of open ocean to see what might lie beyond and eventually populate all of the thousands of islands of the Pacific. And they do this through this system of navigation. And so Tupaia, when he's in Tahiti when Captain Cook's expedition arrives, and he becomes close friends with Joseph Banks, who's the naturalist on Cook's expedition. And he's so curious about what the world is beyond the Polynesia he knows that he agrees to join the expedition. He wants to go all the way back to England. Um, but the thing he offers to Cook's expedition is this knowledge of Polynesia. He draws detailed maps from memory of the islands of the Pacific, their positions, the currents, sometimes even such small details as the best entrance through a reef into a lagoon. And some of this he does from memory, and some of this is based on knowledge passed down to him. Some of these islands are places he's never been himself, but he can tell them all of the details about their position, their location, and the best places to land. And so it's another one of these remarkable moments of exchange that we don't think about as often as we should. We think about Cook, we think about the sort of the bravery and adventure of Europeans sailing across vast oceans, but we don't think about the sort of information they gain from guides and interpreters and indigenous peoples that allows them to see the world in new ways.
No one is more famous for discovering naturalism, almost inventing it, than Alexander von Humboldt, still worshipped in European circles today. Matthew has a secret that I did not know. Alexander von Humboldt had a guide. His name was Carlos del Pino. Who was he, Matthew?
Yeah, so this is another one of those things we often forget. We think about these great expeditions of discovery, and we think about individuals. We think about lone individuals setting out across oceans or into the bush with their machete at the ready. But we don't think about the people that guide these expeditions, the people that interpret for these explorers. And Carlos del Pino is one of these figures for Alexander von Humboldt. When Humboldt first arrives in South America and his ship is approaching shore, del Pino is in a canoe off the coast himself, sees the ship and is immediately curious, rows out, clambers aboard, and immediately engages the great explorer in conversations about the natural world. And it turns out that Carlos del Pino is an explorer himself. He is fascinated by the natural world. He wants to know all he can about it. And so it's this really interesting exchange between von Humboldt and Carlos del Pino. When they first arrive on the coast of South America in Venezuela, del Pino takes them immediately to his own garden to show him the trees and plants he's cultivated, and then agrees to join the expedition into the interior. And throughout the journey is constantly in conversation with von Humboldt about the things they're seeing. He gives them the local names for things, explains the characteristics of plants and animals. And so I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind that so much of the knowledge that is gained in this period by Europeans and Americans is imparted by indigenous people like Carlos del Pino.
Another indigenous person that's just a joy to discover in Matthew's book. His name is John Edmundson. He has an establishment he stuffs animals in Edinburgh, Scotland. And one day, a 16-year-old fascination comes into the shop. Who is John Edmundson? Who's the 16-year-old?
So John Edmundson was born into slavery in South America, in on a woodcutting plantation up in the jungle. And when he's young himself, he meets a Scottish explorer who's traveling through the jungle and ends up on this woodcutting plantation. And from this Scottish explorer, he learns the art of taxidermy, especially of birds. Um, Later on, Edmundston gains his freedom, travels to Scotland, in part because he'd learned about Scotland from this Scottish explorer, and sets up a taxidermy shop in Edinburgh. He makes a good living. He becomes well known as one of the best taxidermists in Edinburgh. And the man who walks in his door one day, the young man, is a dissatisfied medical student named Charles Darwin. And Darwin was a bit at sea at this moment. He was following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather and going into medicine, but didn't really have the interest in it he had hoped. But he was fascinated by the natural world. And in John Edmundson's shop, he got to engage with it firsthand and with someone who shared this fascination with the natural world and with birds in particular. And so when Darwin later sets out on his famous Beagle expedition and lands in the Galapagos Islands and observes the finches that will be so important to his theory of natural selection. It's the techniques taught to him by John Edmundston in Edinburgh in his taxidermy shop that will allow him to preserve the specimens he uses to construct this theory of natural selection. So a fascinating moment of exchange and convergence.
Professor Matthew Lockwood. His book is Explorers: A New History. There are too many directions to go, Matthew. Forgive me. I rushed past Mungo Park. Wonderful story, has lots of guides. Importantly, the guides are entrepreneurs and they gain as much from their travels as Mungo Park does, but Mungo Park is celebrated back in Europe. David Dorr, who is he?
Yes, so David Dorr is another fascinating figure, and this is one of these figures who leaves his own account and his own writing and his own words. So he's born into slavery in Louisiana in the 1820s, and as a young man, he is promised his freedom if he accompanies his enslaver to Europe on a European tour. And they travel through England and France. He stands in Notre Dame Cathedral and marvels at the fact that he, an enslaved man, is walking on the graves of kings and queens. They travel through Europe to Constantinople, and eventually to Egypt. And Egypt is what strikes David Dorr most strongly. And he has this moment where he's standing before the pyramids in Giza, and imagining the men and women who built these vast and important structures. And it's a moment of great pride for him because he realizes, it dawns on him that the men and women who built these structures are Africans like him. And I think this is a really important moment because when we're thinking about discovery and thinking about it as being a matter of perspective, that discovery's in the eye of the beholder. David Dorr's story is really striking because he wasn't the first person to stand before the pyramids at Giza. He wasn't the first American to do so, but he was one of the first enslaved men to have done so and to have written about it. And so he brought an entirely new perspective, a perspective of an African from America. And this was a perspective that allowed him to reimagine a familiar place, a familiar space, as a story of African success, of African ingenuity and genius, something to uplift the people back home and proof to those who doubted it of the brilliance and humanity of African peoples everywhere. And so it's just a really powerful moment.
The Stanley and Livingston story is extremely famous. Didn't happen. However, what did happen is that Stanley found Livingston thanks to two men, Sheikh Rashid and Bombay, and the greeters were Chuma and Sussi. Tell us that, Matthew.
Yes, so Henry Stanley is most famous for this moment. Dr. Livingston, I presume, two men of European background meeting in the middle of Africa. What an unlikely convergence of people. But the story is very different. There were many other people there and many other people responsible for that meeting. So when Stanley first arrives in Zanzibar to begin his search for Dr. Livingston, he has no idea what he's doing. He has no experience. He's a reporter. He has no experience of travel of this sort, and so he seeks out a number of local people, local men who had been on European expeditions before. And in particular, they had joined John Haining Speke and Richard Francis Burton on their expedition in search of the sources of the Nile. Um, they were called by Burton and Speke the Faithfuls. So Stanley seeks them out. And one of the remarkable things he finds is that all five of the men he seeks out still possess the medals they had been awarded by the Royal Geographical Society. And I think this is a really important moment because we usually think of guides and porters and the people who support these expeditions of European explorers, American explorers, as being driven by monetary gain. They travel because they're paid to do so. But if that had been the case, these faithfuls would have sold their precious metals long ago, but instead they kept them because they meant something to them. They were proof of their status as explorers too. And so they lead Morton Stanley into the interior of Africa, where he does come across the camp of Dr. David Livingstone. But the men who greet Stanley when he arrives is not David Livingstone himself, but Chuma and Sussi, two guides and interpreters who had been working with Livingstone for years by this point. And so it's they who greet him and they who witness the moment where Livingstone and Stanley meet. So instead of two Europeans meeting in the middle of Africa, we have two Europeans and many Africans all meeting in the middle of Africa.
And Chuma and Susi go on to many adventures. Remember, these are entrepreneurs. You seek them out if you're a Victorian traveler. Stanley comes back in the 1870s. I believe he spent some time in the Civil War. It's always surprising to see where Stanley pops up.
Yes.
And Susi leads his Congo expedition. What
Yes.
my notes here say 89 to 92, a long expedition.
Yeah.
And
It's
Chuma was with Joseph Thompson's expedition.
Yes, so they continue on, as you say, as entrepreneurs, exploration entrepreneurs. They are the people who European explorers seek out for their expertise and experience. And again, they don't usually end up in the familiar stories, but they are vital to those stories. And Schumann and Susie are fascinating too because when Dr. Livingstone dies in Africa, they think it's important. It is important to them and to him and their relationship with Livingstone to preserve his body and bring it back home, back to Britain. And so they preserve it and they embark on their own expedition with his body across Africa to the coast and then by sea to Britain, where he's interred in Westminster Abbey. Um, and and then travel throughout Britain and help edit Livingstone's diaries. They are they are explorers in their own right, although they are often not included in these great stories.
Yes, the faithfuls are always the bears who run away the moment the Tyrannosaurus Rex shows up. That's how they're used in Hollywood.
Yeah,
Whenever that scene happens again, I will laugh and think of your book, Matthew.
yes.
All
Well done.
right, 20th century, Mary Antin and Allison Williams. Mary Antin travels from what it probably is the Russian Empire's Belarus today, fleeing the pogroms. And Allison Williams has a good job in Trinidad and Tobago, but is fascinated to see London, the mother country. Are they disappointed, Matthew? We have about a minute.
No, I don't think they're disappointed, but I think that the main thing to think about with migration is that this is something that's has existed for human beings since the beginning. And so modern day immigrants, whether they be 19th or early 20th century immigrants like these ones, or those in the present, they are they are driven by many factors, including push factors, but also pull factors, curiosity and imagination and wonder. They want to see New York. They want to see London for themselves. And although they go through many trials and tribulations, they are driven above all by that curiosity, that wonder, and by that very human desire to see the unknown, something that connects us all and that connects us from the beginning of human history to the present day.
And we can only guess who's traveling today and what role they'll play in discovery in the future. We have a planet called Mars. After we get to the moon, Matthew, there'll be explorers in both instances. Don't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I think there are so many frontiers yet to
Right.
be discovered.
Yes, the explorers of Mars. It's wonderful to contemplate it thanks to your book. Matthew Lockwood, Explorers, A New History. The Other, I'm John Batchelor.